technology works. I've just been asked to wait a minute because Cameron Lachlan, who organises the public programme, wants to make an announcement, but he seems to have disappeared. But I'll be patient a second.
Good evening, welcome to Auckland Art Gallery. I'm Kim, I look after the visitor programs. If you're not already a subscriber to our email newsletter, please do join. Go to the homepage, scroll down to the bottom, and there's a little square that says sign up. Once a fortnight only do we send out an email that will let you know what's going on. We've got film program for Corsini, we've got talks coming up. We've got an Italian language weekend over the Labour weekend. If you're coming or friends are coming in over a weekend or a public holiday, the first hour of parking at Victoria Street car park is free. That's not the one across the road, that's Wilson's. If you've got a lot of money you want to get rid of, go and park there. They'll take it off in abundance. About 150 metres further down on the corner of Kisler and Victoria Street, so on a weekend and on a public holiday, bring in your little ticket, parking voucher, and give it to someone at the front desk, and they'll run it through a machine and they will wipe the first hour off it. Okay. Coming up this weekend, very quickly, we've got the wonderful Victoria De Sica's extraordinary film, The Bicycle Thieves, rated still from 1948, it's still in the top 10 best films ever made. So that's here free for you. We also have a talk, a very special talk. Dr. Phyllis Mosman is coming up from Wellington to talk on the relationship with the popes and the Corsini Collection. So good things coming up. And there's also a very special sort of Petra style talk, short talks on architecture on Saturday. Anyway, I hope you know the person next to me because I'm not allowed to introduce her. Look, see, just go. She's our senior curator, Mary Kisler. Would you please welcome Mary? Or could you kiss her?
a series of art bites is just give a very brief snapshot of different aspects that allow you to have a bit of background to the exhibition when you go to see the works. And 3 years ago, I knew nothing about the Corsini family, and certainly the gallery didn't. So this has been a very rich learning curve for everybody here, but it has been a great delight to gradually unravel a lot of the narratives associated with such an important family in Florence, but also a very rich history in Italy. Now, the Corsini family came into Florence in the 13th and 14th century, and they really started off as sheep farmers. When the two countesses came out here for the opening weekend, they kept making analogies between Italy and New Zealand, which was really charming. But the family, of course, once they'd settled, became very involved in local politics in Florence, but they also made their money from banking, an early form of banking, not quite the same as the banking system that we have now. But they, in fact, original banks were literally a table that was set up, and it was called a banco, which was set up in a market, and you could go and borrow money, and then, of course, you had to pay interest on it. And because they ran a lot of their business outside of Italy, they didn't have to pay the same kind of taxes within Florence, but also they were able to, they belonged to a different guild, because they were traders in silk, they were traders in wool, so they belonged to the Calamala Guild, and the guilds were set up. There were a large number of them in Florence, so that whatever business you were involved in, it had some rules and regulations. They also held a lot of public offices in Florence, and right the way through until the 19th century, when they became, one or two of them became politicians. So they have a very, very long history with Florence, just as they do with Rome, and we'll deal with that later. But this is where they came from. It doesn't exist as a town now, called Castel Vecchio, which just means the old castle. It's very close to a village called Poggibonsi, which is still in existence, which is near to Siena. And we don't know why this place was abandoned. It's possible, perhaps, that there was plague, we don't know. But as you can see, there is absolutely nothing left of it, and it's now surrounded by this very rich forest. This is a detail of the family tree that's in the exhibition, and it's a really delightful work. It was done originally as a watercolour by one of the daughters of the Corsini family in 1995, and this segment of it just illustrates some of the leading roles that the family played. Now, in this part that you can see, there are 3 cardinals' hats. There's actually a much earlier cardinal as well. So those are those wonderful red, broad-brimmed hats. You have over on the right, and I'll just show you with the pointer, you have the Pope's mitre. This is when Lorenzo became Pope, Clement XII, and he lived between 1652 and 1740, lived to a great age. In fact, when he was elected Pope, they thought he probably would only live 2 or 3 years, but he lived for another 10 years, and he was a very good and a reforming Pope. But we also have in this family tree other lovely little details. There's a parrot here wearing a crown, and this says Primo Principe, which means the first prince. That was when he was appointed. But I'm very fascinated with Laura Corsini, because she was the inventor of a music drama, which was the prefiguring of lyric opera. So they're a very creative family, and there are more details. Here we have the little owl, which tells of the time when they bought what was a little house on the outskirts of Florence and developed it into Palazzo Porcini, which is where it was built as a palace, and it's where the collection is stored today. Within the exhibition, these are the 3 most powerful figures. On the left, you've got a painting done much later by a very important Italian artist called Guercino of San Andrea Corsini. So painted in 1630, but in fact he lived between 1302 and 1373. He apparently, according to the family, was a bit of a scoundrel when he was young, and then he saw the light and entered the church, and he was elevated to Bishop of Fiesole, and in 1440 he was beatified. That means he had the title Blessed before his name, before being proclaimed a saint in 1629. So he's proclaimed a saint that year, and the following year Guercino does his so-called portrait. And of course, if you look online, there are many paintings of San Andrea. He was quite an important figure in his own lifetime. He was a great supporter of justice and the poor. And when he died, he'd actually, because Fiesole is a little village, I don't know if any of you've been there, very beautiful village, perhaps a small town, no, I think a village. Above Florence, you get a bus and it takes you up there. It's well worth visiting. And when he died, he had said he specifically wanted to be buried in Florence. And the locals, because he was now dear to them, promptly buried him in the church. And so the family thought, we're not having that. So on a stormy night, they went up to the church and they snatched his body and they raced it back to Florence. And of course, the people of Fiesole weren't that pleased with that. They were hot in pursuit. And apparently, San Andrea created a miracle, and the river, the stream of Mugnone stream flooded, and they couldn't get across it. So the family had time to take the body of their relative back to Florence and to bury him there. This is a very important painting too, because it fits within the Baroque period. But there's something you'll notice about this image that you won't see in the exhibition. Because this image, which we received by the family, doesn't have 2 bullet holes in it, whereas the work in the exhibition does. And that is because in 1944, when the Allies were moving up through Italy, many artworks were being snaffled and taken up to Germany. Hitler wanted the biggest art gallery in the Western world. And a lot of works had been taken from places like the Uffizi and the Pitti, and they had been put into a number of country villas, big villas, and they were then going to be shipped up to Germany. And Princess Elena felt it was her duty to save their collection. And a group of the works were taken out in a truck. The servant was too anxious to drive because he knew that the bridges were being mined, and so she drove the truck. They took it out to the family villa of Le Corti, a very important building, which at the time, as I read only this week, was actually pretty well a ruin. Nobody had lived in it for a very long time. And they put the works at one end and they boarded it up, and then they hung their saint on the front to protect the collection. And when the Germans arrived, they were in a hurry. They realised they didn't have time to dismantle the wall, but they saw the wet plaster around the edge, so they knew what might be behind it. And so they shot San Andrea. Not once, but twice. And when I'd seen it in the Palazzo, when I made my first visit 2.5, 3 years ago, I saw the bullet hole in the forehead, and it was only when I went back last year that I saw that in fact there was a second one. The family had thought that perhaps the paintings had been stacked vertically, but if you look at the bullet hole, and I'm no scientist, but the bullet has hit that painting at right angles. And I was told a story by the elderly, their aunt Lucrezia, Countess Lucrezia, and she was a child at the time. So, you know, I think one of the important things about this exhibition is, you know what families are like, we all have different memories of the same thing, and those different versions of the story actually add to the richness of the narrative. Now, on the centre of the screen, we have a very important bust by Francesco Maria Quirolo of Lorenzo Corsini, who was elected Pope Clement XII in 1730 at the age of 78. And it was traditional in Rome for a pope to appoint a nephew as a cardinal. And so that person might not have been in the church before, but their role was to go to Rome and assist their uncle with the work that they wanted to carry out. And certainly in Pope Clement's time, a lot was achieved in Rome. Now, the fantastic portrait on the right is by a French painter, Hyacinthe Rigaud, and he was the darling of the French court. And in 1710, Don Neri Maria Corsini was sent to Paris as a I'll just wait, thank you. If anyone else has got a phone on, can you turn it off, please? Because this has been filling. And he went to Paris as an ambassador. And of course he had to be painted by the leading court painter of the day. And luckily I found a letter published, I found it online, writing back to his family and saying, oh, I'm being painted by Hyacinthe Rigaud. So whereas the family had thought it might have been painted in 1720, we then could pinpoint it as 1710. And of course, he had a very rich and exciting life, and then he got the call to go to Rome. And they managed to achieve an enormous amount in the time that they were in the city. Apart from carrying out various commissions for his uncle, Neri Maria acquired a palazzo that had been owned by the Riario family, which is became known as Palazzo Porcini, and this is the facade of the building. It is not as it looks today. In fact, the street is narrow, but as we know, artists have license, and so the street scene has been opened out so you can see the full facade in all its glory. But the inside of the palazzo, apart from being Neri's private home, was turned into the most remarkable art gallery. So they had the gallery in Florence, belonging to the family there, but this became just as rich, and very importantly, it became also a very important library, which was gifted to the state in the 19th century. The palazzo was acquired by the state, and the collection is free for families and the public to go and visit. But the library is also free, so it is a wonderful research source, and it was the first public library in Italy. So they're a very, very interesting family. Now, back in Florence, after the family had started work on their palazzo, they also, at the same time, wanted to create a chapel for San Andrea. And the family church, even today, is the Church of the Carmine, which is, if you look at it here, you can see it's a relatively plain facade, but inside it has two very important chapels, and one of those is the chapel for San Andrea. And in the exhibition, you'll see on the right the sketch for the dome in the chapel, and of course it's in two dimensions. When artists were being commissioned to paint a work, whether it was a private or a public space, they often first had to do a quick sketch that was of course much smaller than the actual object that they might be going to paint, that suggested what the final design would look like. But of course, it's quite tricky when what you're going to paint is like, it is a dome, it's an inverted bowl if you like, but what you're presenting is something on a flat surface. So here we have San Andrea at the bottom of the painting, and you see the clouds billowing up, and the dove of the Holy Spirit, or the Holy Ghost, is fluttering at the top of the work. But when you look at the dome in situ, what you have instead are figures all around the edge who now can look across at each other, and you see the saint from below as he moves upwards. But the other wonderful thing about this chapel is that it has so much natural light. It has these clear story windows, so you can always see the dome, whereas in some churches, if you go in and the lights aren't on, you actually can see very little. Now, there's a number of other family portraits across time within the exhibition. We don't know who the young woman is who's painted as Flora in that left-hand image. And it was thought somebody, they don't know whether it was 50 or 100 years ago, wrote who they thought it was on the back of the frame in pencil. But in actual fact, once the artist's dates were checked, the family realised that it couldn't be that person because she was no longer living. But it was quite common for a portrait of a young woman to be done when she was ripe for marriage, shall we say, and that would be sent to a prospective spouse. And of course, Flora is the goddess, she's a goddess of fertility. So to depict a young woman as Flora with flowers suggests fertility and freshness and youth, and of course fecundity, because what this woman must produce once she marries is offspring. But it's a particularly beautiful work for the jewellery, and that's why this is one of the paintings that we've highlighted for the children's trail that you can see throughout the exhibition. But also it's important to note that the flowers are botanically accurate. And this focus on accuracy and the study of botany begins in the 15th century and feeds through into the following centuries to come. So there's a lovely reference to nature within the work as well. It's not in perfect condition. Some of this particular painting was unable to be treated for the exhibition, others were treated. But even so, it's an important aspect, and it's wonderful to add another portrait of a woman into the exhibition. But if you move forward into the 19th century, we have two more very important paintings. Palazzo Porcini set off for Vienna as a young man to the court to meet a prospective bride, and that was Baroness Antonietta Wolfsbaden. She was young and she was beautiful and she was wealthy. And after courting her, her father said, well, yes, you can marry her, but you have to sign a contract saying that if she doesn't want to move to Florence, you will sell everything you own and you will come and live in Vienna. Now, he must have loved her. Most matches were arranged matches, but this has to have been a love match because he signed a contract. And fortunately, Antonietta decided she would come to Florence. Now, we know that this is painted on the loggia at the top of Palazzo Porcini. And the loggia had rooms going off it, which throughout part of the 19th century and through into the 20th century were actually used by artists. And Pietro Benvenuti was one of those. So he did a lot of commissions for the family, the extended family. And what you can see in the background of this painting is a view up the valley behind Florence to the mountains behind. But for me, the really interesting thing is the drawing sketch block that she's got open in front of her. She has a pencil or pen in her hand, and the Countess has told us when they came out 2 weekends ago that they think that she's actually drawing a design for the garden at their other palazzo in Florence, which is called Palazzo Porcini al Prato, which means on a field, because it was literally, when it was first acquired, attached to a field. And that was the case with many of the villas and palazzos on the edge of the walled historical town of Florence, that you had access to the fields beyond, whereas the palazzi that were built inside the city tended to be enclosed around a courtyard. So you could have pot plants and that kind of thing, but you didn't have access to real greenery. So we know that it's thought, because when they lived most of the time in Palazzo Corsini al Prato, and she redesigned part of the garden when she was there. There is an Italianate garden, but at the time it was quite fashionable to have an English garden, sort of a la Capability Brown. And so she had fruit trees, but she had an area that didn't have the box parterres that you get in formal Italian gardens that go all the way back to the Renaissance. And one of the countesses think that that's what she's sketching. She's sketching a detail for the garden that she takes responsibility for developing. Now, every family is touched by tragedy, and the Corsini are no exception. Now, Amerigo Corsini, at the age of 17, was sent by his family to Paris to meet a prospective bride. And he spent a lot of time with the two daughters of the former Queen of Portugal. He was attracted to one, so a marriage contract was drawn up, and then he went back to Florence. But at the age of 18, he died. They think possibly of tuberculosis. And his mother, Luisa Scotto Corsini, who was an heiress from Pisa, the port that is linked by the River Arno to Florence, she spent the rest of her life making a shrine to her lost son. She did embroideries, and we have one of the cushions that she embroidered in the exhibition. But she also gathered together all of his watercolours and bound them into this big album, which you can see in the exhibition. And when we started talking about having these kind of family additions to the exhibition, they said, well, you have to have this little painting. It was very high up above a door, and they thought it was a tiny oil painting, and it was only when it was taken down that it was discovered to be a watercolour. And so she was never a professional artist. And if you look at that particular watercolour, it's slightly naive, but it's very, very sweet. It shows this young boy, as a child, sitting at a table with his two tutors in Palazzo Porcini. And we know that it's the palazzo where the gallery is because of the proximity of the buildings that you can see through the window. There are other interesting marriage arrangements as well. Tommaso Corsini, who was the Prince of Laiatico, married Anna Barberini Colonna. Now, the Barberini and the Colonna families were very, very ancient and important families in Rome. And they lived in Palazzo Barberini, which is now the most exquisite museum. If you go to Rome, please don't miss it. Hardly anyone goes. It's got a wonderful sort of slightly run-down garden behind it, but it is the most beautiful building and has a remarkable collection. And this is a portrait done of Anna and her sister Luisa when they're living in Rome as young girls. Tommaso goes to Rome, falls in love with Anna, and they marry. And Luisa decides she'd better marry a Corsini as well because she doesn't want to be parted from her sister. So both of them end up in Florence. And there's a photograph of the two of them as young adult women in the exhibition as well. But Tommaso is a very, very interesting figure because he marks that movement from, if you like, the old world of hereditary tradition and the new Italy that was forming in the 19th century. He, again, was a mathematics graduate from Pisa University. He becomes a politician. He's the mayor of Florence between 1880 and 1886. But also, he's absolutely fascinated with archaeology. Now, Florence is built in an area of Italy that originally wasn't dominated by the Romans. It was Etruscan. The Etruscans were a much, much older civilization that eventually get subsumed into classical Roman culture. And if you travel through Italy, there are remarkable Etruscan tombs that you can visit, and there's an Etruscan section in the Archaeological Museum. And he found a very, very important fibula, which is a kind of beautiful pin with little animals on the top of it, which he donated to the museum. And he was the one who finally sold the Palazzo Porcini in Rome to the state. When families have a vast number of palazzi, they require an enormous amount of upkeep. And I think the family's base was always Florence. Their heart was in Florence, even though members of the church were necessarily based in Rome. But he gifted to the nation the Corsini Gallery and the library. So a very important figure. Now this is what Palazzo Corsini al Carione in Florence looks like. And this is a Baroque palazzo. So it's not built until quite late. And it is opened out from the very beginning with this broad with a central courtyard, unlike those early Renaissance palazzi, as I said, that are always enclosed. And it's called Al Parione, which simply means on Parione Street, because directly behind it there's a road that runs from Piazza Santa Trinita along at an angle and ends up actually at a point at the river. And this palazzo takes up a major block of that. You can see around the top that there are these sculptures, which is a Baroque tradition rather than a Renaissance one. And what's lovely about the print that in the exhibition by Giuseppe Zoffi is you can see that it remains unchanged, except that the road beside the river has been built up slightly. And this part, the road along the river, is called Lungano Corsini, marking the place of the palazzo. And it's a very important building, and the gallery is on the first floor. Following Renaissance tradition, the ground floor was never used for living in. It might have wonderful grottos, it might have a courtyard or a garden, but the living areas were always on what they called the piano nobile, the noble floor, which is the first floor, which is, as it turns out, a very wise thing to do. This is, if you come in at the ground level, in fact the courtyard often has cars parked in it. You go up the staircase and you go through the presentation room. Historically it was called a throne room when there was a throne in it, but the Prince Corsini actually lives at La Corte, that one of the country villas. And so now this is called the presentation room, and it's on the ceiling of this that if you go and look at the dining room in the exhibition and you look at the ceiling, we've done a vinyl, tiny vinyl, compared to the size of this space. You can see where that fresco is placed in the palazzo. But you'll also see around the room all of these portiere or door curtains. They're woven, and then they're appliqued in silk, and they had a very practical purpose as well as a heraldic purpose, because it helps to keep the drafts out. Some of us have curtains on our doors with the same purpose, but possibly not quite as grand. And we're very fortunate that one of these is also in the exhibition. These two candelabra are also unusual because they are wood. And the Countess has told me this story, but the first time I went, they lowered them to the ground on these enormous chains, and they were replacing the candles in the candelabra. And they said at one point, they realised when they lowered them that there was borer dust on the ground. So they rang a restorer and said, we have this problem with our wooden candelabras, there's borer. And he said, oh, can you bring them in? and they were forced to say, no, I think you better come to us. So they've all been restored, but it's interesting to know, considering borer is such a problem here, that you have exactly the same problem anywhere. And this is how the collection is displayed within the palazzo. Each of the paintings has a heavy iron ring on the top, and underneath these ruched velvet or silk, some of the rooms have velvet, these coverings, there is a very heavy chain. So the paintings are supported on a chain, and you simply alter it according to the height. Where the paintings hang is set in aspect. So they're not permitted, even though the family own the paintings, they're not permitted to rearrange them without permission from the superintendent in Florence. So they have to get written permission each time something changes. So of course that was part of the process of getting the exhibition. All of that had to be signed off. But also they're very worn now, but one of the wonderful things about these rooms is these panels here, all of the paler tiles have an accurate botanical study in them. So again, it highlights that passion for botany and learning about science. And I knew I had this here. This is the real ceiling. That's the sketch on the left that's in the exhibition. And this shows the glorification of the family. So you have within the work references to the family here. You've got the family crest, or stemma, as it can be called in Italian. You've got the crown, which marks them having been made princes. There's the bishop's crozier and references to the church members of the family. Here you've got the palazzo also being taken to heaven. The river god is reference to the river Arno, and you've got abundance falling into the representation of the city, which in a literal sense is reproduced here with Brunelleschi's dome for the Duomo, or the Cathedral of Florence. And you have the figures of valor, architecture and ingenuity carrying all of the family and their palace skywards. Now, I told you the narrative about San Andrea. Well, the Annigoni portrait on the left is of Princess Elena Avogadro. And she was the woman responsible for saving the collection. This is a very, very unusual portrait. She didn't want her portrait taken. She told Annigoni, who at this stage also had a studio in the around the loggia in Palazzo Porcini. She didn't want. She said, "I'm too old. I don't want my portrait. And do one of my daughters." He said, "No, I'm going to do your portrait." So she finally agreed to sit for him. But she said, "I don't want you to show me in the city. I want you to show me in the Maremma landscape." Now, the Maremma is this vast and rather wild area between Rome and Florence. And the family had very large farm holdings there, and it's quite mountainous. So he paints her, and obviously she is painted in the studio, and then he does the landscape. But she's painted wearing her husband's hunting cloak. And the Countess has told this gorgeous story about how one day he said to her, "Now you've got to sit very still, you are not to move, because I have to do your eyes, and this is the most difficult part. So no more talking, just rest, let me focus." So she sat there patiently for about 25 minutes, and finally she'd had enough. She said, "You must have done it by now, show me what you've done." She got up and she went to look at the painting, and she couldn't see anything. She said, "You haven't done anything." And then she noticed that he painted a tiny fish hanging from her ear, and in Italy that's a symbol of April Fool. So he got the better of her. Unfortunately, he then painted the fish out. I wish it was still there, because it's a wonderful part of the narrative. But if you go, and you can get very close to this painting because it is glazed, it's in the research room as you go through. And what I was particularly fascinated by, and I hadn't seen it, I hadn't noticed it in Florence, is there are two tiny figures here huddled against the wind as they scurry down a lane. So this is sort of an autumn painting par excellence. But you've also got the two works by Luciano Guarnieri, and he was the student of Pietro Annigoni, and he too, for a while, had a studio in the Palazzo. And you have the two sisters, Anna Lucrezia Corsini, mother of Countess Livia Branca Corsini, who came out 2 weeks ago, who was died a few years ago, and Lucrezia Miari Fulcis Corsini, who is in her 70s, late 70s, so she didn't come. But she is the living encyclopedia of the family stories. And so she and the two countesses walked me around the palazzo, and they were telling me all these things. And because of the exhibition, of course, they kept talking about it. So when the two younger countesses came out, they then had a whole lot of new narratives to tell us, which helped to flesh in the background. So, this is really just a brief overview, but I thought I should show you the other palazzo. So this is Casino. Well, it started off as a casino. It's now, because it was built at the edge, it's now called a palazzo. But you can see immediately that it's much earlier in style. And it has a grand staircase which is added at a later date, which leads you down into the garden. And I found this funny little picture online of what one of the rooms looked like in the 19th century. So, apart from the fact that the chandeliers are bigger, the furniture, could be in almost anybody's home. And there's wonderful sort of floral wallpaper. But the garden you can go and visit. It's open in the weekends, and it's not that far. It's sort of a 15-minute walk from the centre of Florence. But it's well worth going to see, because it's one of the last continuous Renaissance gardens in Florence, even though it has had English additions added to it. And just another little sort of note of interest. The family, I talked about the Maremma, where the Antigone portrait was done. And the family have bred for centuries what are known as Maremma hounds. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen them, but as you can see from the image on the right, they are absolutely enormous. And Maremma hounds will take care of a flock of sheep without a shepherd needing to be present. They're fantastic guards, but I loved the image on the upper left of, I think there are 10 puppies. You can imagine trying to get 10 puppies onto a table and get them to sit still all at the same time. But underneath the table, there's obviously a very patient Alsatian who's not about to have his portrait, his photograph taken. But equally important is the little graphic that's in the bottom of the family tree that's in the exhibition, which is this dog. And it says, in memory of all the dogs, large and small, that across the centuries have shared the lives of so many members of this family. So if you go into the exhibition, around just above the floor, under some of the artworks, you'll see this dog. We called him Arno, and then we discovered that one of the aunts has a dog called Arno, because Arno is the river that flows through Florence. And so we've used that as a motif so children will know where the children's labels are. So, and the family partly were convinced to lend us the works because I said that we really wanted this to be an exhibition for everyone, not just for art lovers, that it's important to educate the art lovers of the future. But one of the other interesting stories they told when they came out was the two younger countesses had to go to all the older members of the family and get permission because Countess Livia owns the palazzo, but she doesn't own the art collection. It was left to a brother and 4 sisters. The brother is no longer with us, but the 4 sisters and their offspring had to approve the works coming to New Zealand. And they agreed because they said when the Allies were coming up through Italy in 1944, the 28th Maori Battalion actually helped protect one of the farming areas where they had people living. And so and the aunt said straight away, we owe this to New Zealand, we have to send them our collection. So it's a wonderful story, and this is Le Corti. I'll finish with this. This is the villa in the countryside, as you can see, a much older construction, and this was where those paintings were hidden during World War II. But you can see from the photograph on the right, the building actually hadn't been lived in for 100 years until the prince moved there, the prince of the time moved there at the beginning of the 1990s. And they've still only restored part of it. This is another family tree. They've got several. And I love this one. It actually looks like a whole load of forks to me, but then I've not seen it in the flesh. But again, on the top of the gates, 2 dogs, which you do get. It's quite a tradition in Italy to have dogs on the top of the gates. But I think in this instance, it's because they were so much loved by the family. So they have a very rich history and a huge responsibility. And each of the families that have moved out into the different palazzos and farmhouses that are scattered through Umbria, through Tuscany, and through the Maremma, have had to think of ways to put their properties to use. So if you want to get married, you can get married in a lot of them. You can have a wedding, you can have a grand dinner, you can go to their restaurants. If you go to Le Corti, it's now a very successful vineyard. I haven't been yet, but I'm planning to go. So there we are. That's just a little bit of background that will just help you as you go through the exhibition. And each week I'll talk about something different in relation to the family. Thanks for coming. Palazzo Porcini and the collection. The buildings are wonderful and the collections are wonderful. Palazzo Porcini has the most incredible huge. Yes, for your next. Oh, well, put it on your list. Oh, fantastic. I agree to go. I don't like it.